You're listening to Great Life, Great Career with Scott Miller, brought to you by FranklinCovey.
Welcome back, everyone. Fascinating insights from Joel Peterson, the chairman of JetBlue Airways, a consulting professor at the Stanford Graduate School of Business, the founder and chairman of Peterson Partners, which is a Utah-based private equity company. Joel and his team of partners there have invested in hundreds of companies, every imaginable upstart industry. I'd love to get into a couple of insights there. Joel, of the hundreds of companies you've been privileged to be a leader in, what's one of the ones you're most proud of, and why did it do so well?
Well, I would say I'd have to say JetBlue, because I carry that role around for the last 12 years. But I do love that company, and I love its founder, entrepreneur, David Neeleman, who's also Salt Lake, was from Salt Lake. So David was a phenomenal entrepreneur, and we've had a couple of great entrepreneurial leaders since then as CEO at JetBlue. But I've invested in a number of them. I was an investor in Vivint, which is another Utah company, in Energy Solutions, another Utah company, Winder Dairy. I think we've done maybe 50 Utah companies out of the probably 250 companies we've invested in.
Joel, for those who are listening and aren't real familiar with private equity, as you look at investing in companies, what do you see as the role of your private equity firm? What's your philosophy?
Well, we have a tagline that says to help entrepreneurs achieve their dreams. And we really, every company, every leader has customers or people they're representing, sometimes called constituents. And so you have to think about prioritizing your constituents. And I think you always have shareholders, you always have customers who are using your product, and you always have your employees. We call them crew members at JetBlue. You can make one or two of them delighted at the expense of the third. In other words, at JetBlue, I could make our customers delighted by giving away tickets, but it would not be a happy day for shareholders. Right. So you're balancing between those three constituents at all times.
Speaking of JetBlue, I saw a great video that went viral on YouTube last week where one of the pilots came out prior to taking off. It was a female pilot, and she told the short story around how she was raised not to believe that females could ever become pilots, and they were kind of relegated to gender-specific roles, and that when her son was asked, I think in elementary school, what he wanted to be, he said, well, not a pilot, because that's a girl's job. And it was interesting. It was just a great, endearing, insightful YouTube. I think JetBlue's got one of the most trusted brands in the nation. Joel, the book that you've just recently rewritten and refreshed called The 10 Laws of Trust, Building the Bonds That Make a Business Great, being published by HarperCollins, out for sale on September 17th of this year. Talk just quickly around why you refreshed that book and why you're so passionate about this topic of trust.
Well, going back to this idea of becoming an entrepreneurial leader, the first thing you have to do is be trusted. You're not going to attract people, you're not going to attract capital, you're not going to attract customers, great ideas, if you're not a trusted person. So you've got to build trust. And the thesis of the 10 Laws of Trust is you can be intentional about becoming a high trust leader and building high trust organizations. So I started to think through my experience with trust and with betrayal and said there are laws, there are patterns, and if we could share those patterns with others, people could learn how to become more trusted. Well, as I gave talks about it, I found that there were a couple of things. People wanted to know, well, what is the level of my of trust in my company, or am I trusted or not? So I actually went to FranklinCovey and said, could you help me develop a diagnostic that gives people a 10-question test, a little bit like the Net Promoter Score idea, where I could say, I am a high trust, medium, or low trust organization, so you know where you're starting. The next thing that people asked was, I don't know if I can recover trust. I've been betrayed. And I always tell them, if you've trusted, you've been betrayed. Betrayal is one of the fruits of trusting. Hopefully it's not something that happens all the time or often or in truly permanent ways, but you do risk betrayal if you trust. So you want to learn how to overcome betrayal. And so I wanted to add those two things to this book. And so FranklinCovey helped me and HarperCollins helped me, and we'll be doing a second edition.
So Joel, this second edition, which I've read, is enormously applicable for everyone, whether you are a formal leader or not. I think one of the topics I found the most interesting is the one you just mentioned, which is the final kind of bonus chapter you've added in called Betrayal, When Trust Fails. For anyone, regardless of whether they're an entrepreneurial leader or they're a mother, what advice would you give people on protecting yourself from betrayal, if you even can, and how do you bounce back from it?
So first of all, let me just say what betrayal is. I think betrayal is any time people don't deliver on a promise. And sometimes they don't deliver on a promise because they didn't understand the promise, the directions weren't clear, there was a lack of understanding. That is a relatively easy kind of betrayal to fix. And so I think that's important to know, that most of the betrayals that we have in life, if we'll fix them quickly, we can move on and it's not a problem. The problem is when you've had a serious betrayal where somebody has actually done something dishonest or not been transparent or whatever, and you really feel violated. That's the most difficult kind. And I think the first kind you can repair, fix, make work again, and sometimes it can make the trust stronger. The second kind, I think, rarely can you fix those. And so the issue is, how do you get beyond them? And I found that the only way to get beyond them is to start focusing on the future. And usually that means forgiving the past, forgetting about the past. I mentioned that Cortez, when he landed at Veracruz, burned the ships. So people couldn't go back. They had to only look to the future. And in a sense, that's the kind of model you have to think about when you're working your way through one of those kinds of serious betrayals. You have to burn the ships, and that means you have to forgive and start focusing on the future. And if you haven't, and if you're not, if you find yourself returning to the betrayal, you've not yet overcome it.
Joel, it's no exaggeration to describe your career as being wildly successful. Doesn't mean you haven't had setbacks. I know you have. You've shared some of them with me in some quite inspiring and really relatable times. You could do anything you want. You could be the CEO of any Fortune 500 company. You could be a governor, a senator. Heck, you probably could run for president and maybe even win. With really this enormous opportunity at your hands, why do you choose to spend so much of your time as a professor teaching graduate students about leadership and business? Why is that such a passion of yours?
Well, first of all, I don't think I could do all those things. But secondly, I love young people. I really think they are the future. And I think there's huge leverage. I've taught now 3,000 MBA students. In fact, this week I've got several calling in. They're at a place in their companies or their careers where they've come up against a real problem and they want to chat about it. And I think many times those 15 to 20-minute chats, I can change the trajectory of somebody's life or their decisions, which then changes the trajectory of a number of other people's. And I actually think that you make a difference in individual lives much more powerfully than you make a difference at a very high level. We need people to do that. I wish I were able to do that in certain instances, but I've found my niche is actually in coaching and helping and backing entrepreneurs and helping them become true entrepreneurial leaders.
Joel, speak directly to the budding entrepreneur, someone who's either in high school, college, they're out, and they're interested in bringing their vision to life. What advice would you give the early stage entrepreneur who has an idea, they're passionate about it? What are some of the mistakes or things people forget to think about as they're jumping that leap into entrepreneurship?
Well, first of all, I think they have to really think hard about what problem it is they're solving. Businesses work because they're doing something that other people need. It's a gap in their lives, and you're filling it, and you're filling it in a way that delights them. And so I think you have to really be clear-eyed about that. Then I think you have to think about, well, what is the competition? And it's not just the competition, but what are the substitutes for that idea? So you have to be clear-eyed about that. And then I think you have to start assembling the pieces and build what's called a business model, where you say, this is how we have revenue, these are what our costs are, and this is how. So you have to make sure it works. And I think a lot of times entrepreneurs have these grand visions and a big idea, and they start forward, and they've not done the detailed work. And I think that's maybe the difference between just sort of these entrepreneurs who fail, who are flash in the pan, and those who actually build enduring enterprises.
Great advice. Joel, take that one step further for maybe the next phase entrepreneur, someone who's had some success, they've got some fast growth going on, it's kind of getting out of hand, and they need some investment. What advice would you give people who are coming to groups like yours that are seeking you out because they want to have some investment? They want someone to believe in them. Before someone could walk in your door, what would you tell them to say? Make sure you've got these 3 or 4 things thought through, or otherwise the meeting ain't going to go so good.
Well, I think it's those same kinds of things to have a really clear plan to know what you're going to do with the money. But I think the most important thing you're doing is you're figuring out whether there's a fit. Money has faces, and it's not Benjamin Franklin or Thomas Jefferson. It is the faces of the people who are making the investment. There are investors who add value, and there are people who, as investors, who actually drain the entrepreneur. I had one investment I made where they said we drive them hard and we put them up wet and we hope they make it, and if they don't, we shoot them in the head. And that's kind of the attitude of some of the investors. You don't want that investor. You really want somebody who will actually work with you, teach you, help you through hard times. And you're trying to find a fit. Not everybody works well together. We're not the right investor for certain kinds of entrepreneurs, and we are for others. Mm-hmm. And that's the same, I think, with there's a market out there, and you want to make the market. I think a lot of times entrepreneurs get so hungry, so desperate for money that they're selling. They shouldn't be selling. They should be interviewing the investor as much as the investor is interviewing them.
That's really profound advice. Joel, you talk a lot about your passion around mission and clarity, and that an entrepreneur leader is responsible for making sure that they've developed clarity around what peak they're really trying to climb. It's a metaphor. Expand on why, through all these, almost 50 years of experience you have, why clarity is so important in terms of a competency for an entrepreneurial leader.
It's interesting. People struggle with, they think that everybody knows what they're trying to do because they say a few simple things. But if you go in and interview most organizations, people don't really know. They have a bunch of different ideas about what you're trying to do. It's really hard to get a phrase that you reinforce, that you collect stories around, and that becomes a passion. If you get that, you have everybody pulling in the same direction. I know at JetBlue, it was David Neeleman who started out by saying we want to bring humanity back to air travel. And that was a powerful notion, humanity. And Dave Barger, our second CEO, said we want to serve humanity. And so we started doing service projects, helping out in various ways, giving volunteer hours, and we found that we attracted better people and kept better people, and there's a culture of service within the organization. And by the way, the airline industry is a service business. And if you get that culture of service, you're climbing the right peak then. So you might think, an airline just is a big tube that moves people from one place to the other. But really, if you think about it, it is a service. It's about service, it's about hospitality, and it's about safety. And I think if you really say, this is the peak, these are our values, and you want to be clear about those and you reinforce them and you budget around them, then I think you can deliver on it. If you're vague about it, it just doesn't work. And if your purpose is to make money, which you have to do, but if that's your fundamental purpose, you'll probably fail.
You're listening to Great Life, Great Career. I'm your host, Scott Miller. Our guest today is the famed entrepreneur, private investor, CEO, chairman, serial leader, and author of the book, The 10 Laws of Trust, Building the Bonds That Make a Business Great, on sale September 17th by HarperCollins. Joel, I want to spend a couple minutes talking about stars and divas. You've written extensively, you've spoken a lot about how entrepreneurial leadership is fundamentally also about building the right team, assembling the right types of people, attracting and keeping talent. You've kind of coined this phrase, stars and divas. Talk a little bit about that. What's the difference? Why are they good and bad?
Well, it's hard to distinguish them for a long time. I mean, stars and divas do a lot of the same kinds of things. They're extraordinary people. They're high energy. They attract whatever it is you're trying to attract. They work hard. They're amazing people. The star, however, is spreading a culture. It is he or she is spreading credit to others, is really developing a team that is durable, that is enduring. The diva is attracting credit, is shining the light on themselves. And you're not always sure. I've sometimes taken a bit of time to figure out, am I dealing with a star or with a diva? And over time, you pretty well figure it out. And I think you can build on stars. You need to remove divas. It's hard to do because they are so valuable. But I think if you're going to build an enduring organization, you have to build it around stars and around great people who support the stars, and divas just don't do that.
Joel, let's spend the last couple of minutes talking about failures and successes. You're quite abundant, generous with talking about mistakes you've made, and because you have lots of successes, and you let me talk about those. Is there any failure that you've had or mistake you've made that you'd be willing to share that people who are listening to today's program can learn from?
Well, I've made a lot of them, and I think anybody who's done a lot of things has failed at some of them. I think the idea of failure, I think, is something that might be worth taking a second on, Scott. I think people have a failure of results that is completely understandable and should not penalize them. In fact, any entrepreneur is going to fail at certain things. If you're trying things, you're going to be failing. Somebody said to me one time, if you're not failing, you're not trying hard enough. But there are failures of character, and there are failures of effort. And those two kinds of failures will stick with you forever. So I think you want to make sure that your failures are just failures of results. If you have failures of character or failures of effort, you will have damaged your brand going forward, and it'll be hard to recover from those. Failures of results won't. Now, you've asked about failures I've had. Well, I've had a bunch of businesses. I've taken businesses into bankruptcy. I've been in litigation a couple of times. I'm not proud of any of those things. There were misjudgments along the way. There were misguided trust relationships. I mean, there were a whole series of things, and so I regret them. I've learned from them. I've tried to change the things that took me there, but I think you move forward.
Joel, last question. What did you like most about Stephen Covey? You were a good friend, longtime associate. You joined his board of directors, nearly 30 years ago. We've been a public company for, over 20 years. What did you find so interesting about Dr. Covey that you would choose to join his board of directors?
I think everybody would say that he had great ideas and great ways of expressing them. So that was obvious, and that was at the surface. And, of course, I noticed that too. But the thing that attracted me to him was that he was authentic. I mean, he was if he said something, he meant it. And if you challenged him, he would say thank you, and he would learn from it. If he encouraged you to listen, he would listen too. He would capture what you taught. In other words, he lived the various things that he taught, and I found that really endearing and powerful.
Such a great conversation, Joel. Thank you for your generosity, your abundance this morning. You're headed off to class. You have a lot going on. 2 books that are coming out, The 10 Laws of Trust, available on September 17th, and followed by a new book by HarperCollins called Running Stuff. If you'll have us, we'll love to have you back someday, Joel.
I'd enjoy it. Thank you, Scott.
Thank you so much. You've been listening to Great Life, Great Career